So today I've got for you one of the greatest startup stories of all time.
The greatest. Wow, this bar is set very high.
Get ready to have your mind blown. Okay?
Okay, hold on. Mentally preparing. Okay. I'm
Ready? All right, let's go. So I'm going to take you back to 2005.
Okay. What
All
was
right.
I wearing? Yep, got it.
Okay. Would you like to tell everybody?
No.
Okay.
It was tragic.
Okay. All right. So a guy named Brian Chesky is in design school at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design.
Yes. Yep. I know
Okay.
that place.
So he's studying to become a designer, and while he's there, he meets a guy named Joe Gebbia.
Okay.
Okay, I might say Gebbia sometimes because this is actually an interesting story I just learned. He used to go by Gebbia, but he somewhat recently, within the last couple of years, did like a family genealogy project and found
wow.
out where his family was from and found out that they actually say Gebbia there.
Oh, that's interesting.
So he has actually changed how he pronounces his last name, and so now his last name is Gebbia.
That's interesting. And I've actually heard people do that. There's a Real Housewife that she was Teresa Giudice, and then now she says Giudice. And I just thought maybe she was just being like an obnoxious Italian, but maybe she did a genealogy thing too, and she's just like getting back to her root. You know what? I shouldn't judge people
Maybe,
who
but
change their name.
yeah, but I'm not going to say anything.
Okay.
Okay. So Joe was another designer at RISD, and the two hit it off and became good friends. And they graduated, like I said, in 2005.
Okay.
Okay. So after college, Brian takes a job as an industrial designer in LA.
Okay.
So moves across the country, and Joe actually ends up in San Francisco, also as a designer. And Brian enjoyed his job. You know, I mean, I think he was content, but he wasn't loving it. But Joe was like really loving the city of San Francisco. And so for like 2 years, he was trying to convince Brian to move from LA to San Francisco and start a company with him. He just had this idea in his mind that the two of them should start a company together and they should do it in San Francisco because he was loving it.
Yeah. That's all friends just try to get you to like move near them.
Yeah.
Not necessarily start a company together, but very ambitious.
Yeah. So in October of 2007, Brian had heard it enough times, I guess, and he decided, all right, I'm going to do this thing. So he quit his job and made the move from LA to San Francisco.
Okay, so he's one of those ones that quit and went all in to start a business.
He did. I mean, and when you were saying that in the last segment, I was thinking about this story. So he actually took it to the extreme. So he only had $1,000 in his bank account.
Oh my gosh.
He did not have a job lined up in San Francisco. And his portion of rent for 1 month was $1,150. So he didn't even have enough money to cover 1 month of rent.
Oh my gosh.
Without a job.
He really went all in. Wow. Zero safety net there.
Yeah. And his parents could not have thought it was a worse decision.
Oh.
So all they wanted for him was to get a stable job out of college, which he did,
Right.
and have health insurance. They thought, that's what success was in America.
That is
And
such the bare minimum. That's so sad.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think, they wanted him to have a good job,
Right.
but like, a job with health insurance. And all he did was quit his job and no longer have health insurance.
Oh gosh.
So he had to come up with $1,150 a month. And also they had a vacant third bedroom in the apartment that they had to cover rent for as well.
Oh my
and they didn't
gosh.
really want a third roommate.
Oh my goodness. Oh wow.
So they had to figure it out fast, and luckily they had an idea. So they knew that there was a design conference coming up in San Francisco. They were designers, and they probably knew people that were going to it. And they also knew that all of the hotels were sold out, or were going to be sold out for this conference.
I think I know what story this is.
Did I not even mention what we're talking about?
No, but go on.
They assumed there were going to be more people looking for a place to stay than, just the hotels, which were all sold out. So they had 3 air mattresses and they had a spare bedroom in their apartment.
Right.
So they decided, all right, let's put up a website. We'll call it Air Bed and Breakfast. We'll put these 3 air beds in our spare bedroom, and we'll see if we can get anybody to book out the room and stay on the floor on these air mattresses in our apartment.
Wait, so the air came from air mattress?
Yes, it did.
Get out. I had no idea. That's so funny. Oh my gosh. We've come a long way, but okay.
Yeah, so the site was originally called Air Bed and Breakfast, and they booked 3 guests and made $1,000 in one weekend.
Oh, wow.
The first weekend.
Wow. So, so these people felt that it was better to do that than to buy an air mattress when they got there and find somebody who already had a hotel room to like shack up with.
I guess maybe they didn't know anybody.
Yeah. That must be. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, feels kind of weird. So they also thought that like this wasn't their idea for their company at first. Like they did think it's kind of weird. It's probably not going to be very big,
That's so
very
funny.
niche.
Yeah.
Thought maybe they could just do it once in a while when there was a conference in town, which is a lot of the time, to make money. I thought, so the first time I heard about Airbnb, and so if you haven't guessed by now, we're talking about Airbnb.
Surprise.
I learned about it a few years after this, but it was still, generally the same concept at the time where you were renting out a room in someone else's house.
Right.
And that was very different I didn't want to do that at the time.
Yeah. Well, wasn't that the time though where like couch surfing was a thing?
Yeah. So couch surfing was another website.
There was an actual website called couch surfing.
Yeah.
Okay. I just kind of remember like that time in our lives, and I don't know if it's because of the period in life that we were in, but like people were doing more couch surfing than I.
Yeah, but it was still very niche. Like it was like only certain people would do that. Because
Right.
then
Yes,
you
yes,
didn't even
yes.
necessarily have your own room. You might be on their couch
Yeah.
in their living room.
Like businessmen weren't like.
Yeah. No,
couch
this was
surfing.
like somebody who'd stay in a hostel.
Yes, yes,
Like
yes.
maybe
Yeah.
a subset of people who would
Yes.
stay in a hostel would
Yep.
stay on
They were
someone's
like
couch.
hostel-y people.
Yeah. So they did realize, though, okay, after they did this, they were like, all right, well, maybe there is a market for this. Let's test it out.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian asked Joe, because Joe had been in San Francisco for a while, who's the best engineer that you know? And Joe immediately said Nate, a guy named Nate Blecharczyk. All right? He was a Harvard graduate and a computer engineer with past startup experience. And Brian and Joe were both designers. So like they were great at the web design portion, but they didn't know how to build anything.
right.
They weren't programmers. So they reached out to Nate, and Nate was in. So they, it was pretty easy for them to find their programmer that they needed.
Right.
So around this time, they also, the team also met Michael Seibel,
Oh.
just by chance.
My goodness.
One of the founders of Justin TV. So if you've listened to our past episode on Twitch, Michael Seibel was one of the founders of Justin TV, became Twitch, and then he also founded Social Cam, and now he's at Y Combinator. So Michael sort of acted as a mentor for them. He was running Justin TV at the time, and so he was giving them startup advice. And so it was at this time that they changed their vision from purely around conferences and finding people who wanted to go to conferences but couldn't find a hotel room, to making a website that just made it as easy to book a room in someone's house as it was to book a hotel.
Yeah.
That was what they wanted to do. So this takes us to the 2008 Democratic National Convention in Denver, okay?
Yeah, okay.
So they just relaunched their website before this convention. And the reason that they decided to go to Denver was they realized there were only 20,000 hotel rooms in the Denver area for an 80,000 seat arena where Barack Obama would be speaking.
Yeah, good research
Yeah.
that they did.
So they were still trying to drum up users through these conferences and conventions and things like that.
Yeah.
Even though their website, they were expanding beyond that. They got covered by TechCrunch. But at first, like they had a really hard time getting any press outside of that. TechCrunch thought it was interesting because it was a startup.
Right.
So, they got it out there for startups, but news media wasn't interested. They just thought it was weird. Even local media wasn't interested. They ended up with about 800 hosts that signed up for the DNC to have a guest in their house, of which 80 people booked.
Okay.
So, they had some people, but like there was a huge gap between the number of hotel rooms they saw and the number of people that could fit in the arena. So I'm not sure what those other people did.
Right.
But so on the press side, though, there were one or two local blogs that decided they'd write about Airbnb. So Airbnb was, pitching themselves to all these outlets. And after those blogs wrote their story and some of the news media outlets read those stories and, thought it was interesting, they actually called them back. They called the founders back and they said, hey, would you be interested in coming on? Yeah. So then they got on all of these news outlets. They got on CNN, CBS, all the big outlets.
It just takes one to like open the door for them.
Yeah.
Or two, I guess.
So something interesting happened around this time. Also, one potential host asked if he could rent out his whole house for the convention because he was actually going to be out of town. So he was like, I won't be there, but I can rent out my house. They can have the entire house, or I can break it apart into separate rooms that different guests can rent out. And they said, no, we don't do that.
Oh, that's so funny.
They said there has to be somebody there because who's going to make them breakfast?
So right, because it's a whole
breakfast was a requirement. Was it initially a requirement when it was Air Bed and Breakfast?
Oh, yep. Yeah, because that's what a B&B is.
Yeah, exactly. So soon after this, they eliminated that requirement when they realized, this could be bigger if people can rent out the entire house. But I thought that was a funny story. So after the DNC, they didn't have a ton of bookings yet, but they had some, and they had, they demonstrated that they could make some money. So they started pitching investors. This was August 2008.
Okay.
And Michael Seibel, who we talked about, introduced the founders to about 20 investors. He emailed them, so he gave them warm introductions to all of these potential investors. None of them invested, none of the 20. One of them in particular, the founders told a story about. He showed up late to the meeting, to the investor, to the pitch. When he got there, he didn't come and sit down. He went and ordered a smoothie. Apparently, it was a pretty intricate smoothie because it took like 15 minutes to make it. And so when he finally did come sit down, they said he sat there slurping his smoothie.
Oh my gosh.
For a few minutes, basically, while, listening and just not saying anything. And then halfway through their pitch, he just puts his smoothie down, gets up, and leaves.
Oh my gosh.
And he doesn't say anything. So Brian and Joe are the ones that are there pitching him. And they just look at each other and they're like, is he just going to the bathroom or something? And the dude just never comes back.
Wow. That's so, I feel bad.
Yeah.
That's so rude.
I know I don't think they've said publicly who that investor was, but just by telling that story, obviously that investor knows who they are.
Right.
And they also know that they missed out on one of the greatest startups and best returns of all time.
Right.
So I think that's good enough.
I hope that smoothie was worth it.
Yeah. So investors just felt like most people wouldn't open up their homes to strangers, strangers they met over the internet. Like they just had a lot of doubts about what this could become. And if you look at what happened after the DNC, so, they had 80 bookings during the DNC, but after that, bookings fell to almost zero. Yeah, they really could only get bookings for big events, and it was a very manual process.
Yeah,
they had to go there. They had to figure out a way to get all these people to their site. They had in every market that they went to, they had this chicken and egg problem.
Yeah.
So like all marketplaces have this because you have to have the supply side and the buyer side, and they needed to do that in every city.
Yeah.
So it wasn't something like eBay where you were shipping, so you just had to have buyers anywhere and sellers anywhere. So yeah, so that was a major problem for them, and they needed money badly. So Airbnb had only made like $5,000 total at this point.
Yeah.
And they didn't have any investment. And they had a baseball. So you know those binders of baseball cards?
Yes.
Like kids use?
Yeah.
To put baseball cards in. So they had one of those with all the plastic sleeves.
Uh-huh.
But instead of baseball cards in it, they had credit cards.
Oh.
And they were using those credit cards to fund their company.
Oh.
So when one would get maxed out, they'd
Yeah.
throw it in the binder,
Oh my gosh.
open up a new one,
Oh.
max it out,
This
throw it in
sounds
the binder.
so-
They racked up somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 of credit card debt,
Oh my gosh.
personal credit card debt, funding this company.
That stresses me out.
Yeah. So they realized we have to do something fast. And so what they did during the election, they created specialty branded boxes of cereal. And they called them Obama O's and Captain McCain Crunch
Oh my gosh.
cereals. And they sold these limited edition boxes of cereal, which were just repackaged cheap cereal, like the cheapest they could find, for $40 a box.
Wait, you can do that? You can just resell cereal?
Well, they did it.
Okay.
They made these boxes. They moved the cereal into these boxes and they sold them, and they sold
Wow.
out in 3 days.
Oh my
All of
God.
the
Wow.
cereal that they made. They made $30,000 selling cereal.
Oh my gosh. The power of fandom. I mean, yes, I can kind of see that. Like you can say something's a limited edition box of anything that people are like a Taylor Swift and Kelsey box of
There you
like
go.
generic cereal. I'm sure we'll go for a lot just because of the leveraging fandom.
Yeah. I have no idea the legality of doing this, but they did it, and they made a bunch of money. So that helped, hold them over for a while, because that was 6 times more money than they'd made so far
That's
on the
insane.
Airbnb website.
I'm surprised they didn't just like pivot and like
To be serial
that,
entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
So at this time, as I mentioned, they had been talking to Michael Seibel, and he told them about Y Combinator. And so they applied to YC. I mean, they might have already known about Y Combinator living in San Francisco, but he sort of had an in there.
Right.
And they got an interview. And originally, when they got an interview, their interview was with Paul Graham. He thought their idea was crazy.
Right.
Just like most of the investors thought the
Yeah.
idea was crazy.
Yeah.
Because at that time, their model still focused only on people staying in the same host as their guests.
Yeah. Right.
And everybody kind of thought that this just wasn't going to be big, like it wasn't going to be huge. But before they left the interview, so they had a feeling they weren't going to get in, right? But before they left the interview, they gave Paul Graham a box of their Obama O's, and they told him the story about the cereal, what they did to raise money. And he loved it. Like, he loved their hustle. He was like, I don't know if this is going to be your thing or what, but like, I love what you guys have been able to do, and just, that you've been able to make this happen so far. And so they got into Y Combinator.
Oh my
And
gosh.
they started in January 2009, so in the winter 2009 batch. At that time, the investment from Y Combinator was $20,000, and there were 16 startups in that batch. If you remember back to 2009, it was the middle of the financial crisis.
Right.
So another reason it wasn't probably not very favorable for them to be raising money. But, they got this investment, and more importantly for them, they got some pretty amazing advice from Paul Graham.
Okay.
So Paul Graham likes to say that it's better to build something 100 people love than something 1 million people kind of like.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because you can always grow from the 100 people that love you. You're going to have loyal users who are going to tell their friends,
Right.
and you can grow.
Right.
But if you have 1 million people who kind of like you, you're probably going to go in the opposite direction, because they're
Yeah.
not going to share their experience.
Right.
He's probably going to get old.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a one time they use you once or whatever. So in their first office hours with Paul Graham, Paul asked them where their market is, basically, like geographically. And they said, well, we don't really have a market yet, but we've noticed New York is kind of growing. We have 30 listings there. So that was their biggest city on the platform so far. And Paul Graham was basically like, well, then what are you doing here? Go to New York.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And, that hadn't occurred to them.
Right.
So they went to New York.
Oh my gosh.
And they did a couple of things that were very important. So another key piece of advice that Y Combinator is known for giving, and Paul Graham specifically, is at the beginning, you need to do things that don't scale when you're growing your product or your service.
This is like such counterintuitive advice.
It is.
So
Well,
fun.
it is. So, but at the beginning, when you're trying to get that flywheel going, you can't just rely on viral growth. You don't have you don't have enough users yet.
Yeah.
So you need to do things to kickstart it.
Oh.
And so that's what, that's what they tell you to do. So the founders noticed that the pictures on their website didn't look very great. So, they were poorly lit.
Right.
They were dark. They weren't staged well.
Right.
So they offered to their hosts, they said, hey, we're going to send out somebody to take professional photos of your place.
Yeah.
And we'll swap them out with the pictures you have on the site. And we think it'll help you get more listings.
Yeah.
And obviously, these hosts are trying to make more money. So they said, sure, yeah, send somebody out.
Right.
So Brian and Joe fly out to New York City, where they're going to do this experiment themselves. They rent a camera.
Oh, they're the photographers?
Yeah, they're not going to hire anybody.
So scrappy.
Yeah, well, and there's another reason that we'll get to in a minute. So, and they meet with the hosts and they take the pictures. And besides getting better pictures, so they're designers. They have, an eye for these things.
Yeah.
They also have a nice camera.
True.
Besides being able to get these nice pictures, they also get a chance to talk to the hosts about how their experience is going, and learn about the problems that they're having with the website, with the process for hosting, maybe what they see as some of the problems that buyers might be facing, like those sorts of things. So Joe and Brian leave New York and head back to San Francisco with these photos, all of these ideas, and they send these ideas to Nate, who is working on the site.
Yeah.
And Nate says, oh, I can fix all that stuff. That's not too hard. He fixes it all in one night.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. And they have the hosts, swap out these photos, and they reach back out to the hosts a couple days later or the next day and tell them, oh, hey, we've implemented all of the changes that you guys asked for. And the hosts couldn't believe it. That they had they couldn't believe that the founders flew out and, took pictures of their house.
Right.
First of all. But then they made all these changes for them.
Yeah. It's like rule number 3 in Y Combinator: talk to your users and see.
I don't know if they're in order, but yes, that is one of the main rules.
I'm learning all these things.
So the next week, their revenue for Airbnb, which was stuck at $200 a week for months, doubled to $400.
Yeah.
So, which was a huge deal. I mean, they hadn't seen any growth or traction or anything. It's, it's only $400 a week, but
still,
that's huge.
Yeah.
And so those were the only notable changes that they made.
Right.
So they knew what caused their growth.
Yeah.
So they said, well, let's go back and do it again.
Yeah.
So they flew back across the country to New York. They did it again. They went to even more hosts. And the next week, their revenue increased to $800.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's that face-to-face presence of the users seeing the founders and but heard.
Well, yeah, but I mean, these are the sellers, so you still need to attract the buyer. So I mean, the bigger thing was learning about their problems, but the biggest thing was the photos.
Yeah.
If you're looking at a place to stay at, I mean, think about even right now.
Yeah.
If they don't have good pictures, I mean, whether you're gonna buy a place or rent an Airbnb,
realtors do this all the time. Yeah.
So I mean, they just make such a huge difference.
Right.
So that traction continued. They had sort of cracked the formula a bit of how they could make this thing grow faster, or at least one piece of it. And so then an investor at Sequoia, one of the big venture capital firms, came by Y Combinator and asked Paul Graham, who he sees as the big, maybe the potential breakouts in the batch. And Paul said, well, I really like these guys at Airbnb, what they're doing. So Sequoia met with Brian and Joe, and while everybody else told them pretty much, all the other investors told them that their idea was stupid, Sequoia thought it was brilliant.
Oh, it just takes one.
Yeah. And in April 2009, Sequoia invested $585,000 into Airbnb.
Gosh. Wow. That's their big break.
They really needed that because they had heard so many times that their idea was stupid.
Yeah.
And, when you hear it that many times, even if you're that passionate about it, you might start to believe it.
Right.
And so, they needed that. So they said that was a big moment for them, like a decisive moment for them in sort of turning their company around.
Mm-hmm.
So by August 2009, they were making $10,000 a week through Airbnb.
Man.
So growth really started to pick up fast. So there's a couple of different things that they did to get the site to continue growing. One, the founders, Joe and Brian, kept traveling to different cities, to big events, to get the word out about Airbnb, to help taking photographs. They also built out a feature in Airbnb that, with a click of the button, allowed hosts to repost their listing directly to Craigslist.
Oh.
Which I think violated Craigslist terms.
Yeah.
I don't think you were allowed to do that,
Okay.
but they got away with it for long enough that the people could immediately broadcast their Airbnb listing onto Craigslist, where millions and millions of people were searching, way more than knew about Airbnb.
Right.
And so they got a ton of traffic that way.
Oh, that's funny.
They also got more new hosts that way because because Craigslist had a housing section.
Yeah.
And so they would reach out to hosts, to people that were renting out their houses on Craigslist, and say, hey, you can do this better, and we'll manage, you can manage this better on Airbnb.
Yeah.
And so they got a ton of new hosts that way. Also frowned upon by Craigslist.
Right.
But they were able to do this. And I mean, as a founder, you've got to be scrappy like that.
I know.
And they showed that they were.
Definitely think outside the box. I mean, everything from the cereal box to like posting on Craigslist shows that they'll bend rules a little bit.
Yeah. They expanded their professional photography program. So that, they had more than just the founders doing it as well.
Oh, yeah.
To, more listings, because they learned through paying attention to the metrics that it actually increased bookings up to 3 times by having professional looking photos for a listing. By November of 2010, they had booked a total of 700,000 nights
Oh my gosh.
on Airbnb, and they raised a Series A round of funding for $7.2 million.
Oh my gosh.
So at this point, no longer did people think their idea was stupid,
Yeah. Oh.
which is pretty awesome. That, they believed in it for so long, and now the investors are finally starting to come around.
Yeah. And again, it just takes one, and then people are like, "Oh wait, what am I missing out on? I want in on this too."
Yeah, and they saw the growth. I mean, it's hard to deny at this point
when the numbers are there.
Yeah. So they were also, in addition to being scrappy, they were also pretty frugal at the beginning.
I'm sure.
At first, out of necessity.
Right.
But at this point, so they had 25 employees, and all of them, including the founders, were working out of Brian and Joe's apartment.
The 3-bedroom?
Yeah.
Oh
So I don't think they were renting out the 3rd bedroom anymore, but so they would have meetings in the bedroom. They would have interviews like in the hallways or on the roof. They just used all the space that they could.
Oh my gosh. I would be, I don't know, if I like went to interview and it was like someone's bedroom, I'd be like, yeah, I don't want to work here. But that's the startup life, I guess.
Yeah. They were very early stage. Yeah. So Airbnb has faced some notable issues throughout their lifespan, though. So the first one is regulation. In a lot of cities, especially big cities, with big, powerful hotel markets, the hotel industry didn't just roll over here and let Airbnb come in.
I'm sure.
So in New York City, for example, there is a very high hotel occupancy rate. There is also a housing shortage and not a ton of space in general. And so the hotel industry fought hard against Airbnb. They argued that letting people rent out their apartments would further worsen the problem of affordable housing in the city, because if more properties are becoming rentals, that means fewer properties are for people who live there. And obviously this is what the hotel industry is going to say.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether, I think there is some truth to it, but like that's obviously going to be their stance. In late 2013, New York City actually started to crack down on what some people called these illegal hotels. Because these cities had different restrictions and regulations, most of which weren't really enforced, but like individuals weren't supposed to be able to own more than 2 rental properties.
Oh, I did hear about this. Yeah.
Right. So, and although it was a small percentage of hosts that owned more than 2, they actually made up a large percentage of, I think like a third of the listings on Airbnb, because some of those smaller, some of those individual hosts owned a lot of properties that they were listing out on Airbnb. Another challenge that they faced. So the first time that there was ever really a serious incident at a host's property on Airbnb wasn't until 2011.
Okay, wow.
And
I'm surprised.
Yeah. So this place got trashed. They had they had a party. The occupants, they trashed the place. People stole a bunch of really expensive stuff.
Gosh.
And the founders knew this was going to happen eventually. Like they had in the back of their mind, but like they were very fortunate. It took a few years, and well past the beginning of Airbnb, they'd already raised a couple rounds of funding. They had already grown pretty huge. So even though they got some negative publicity from this, it wasn't enough. They were far enough along. It didn't kill the company.
Right.
But they realized they really had to focus on building trust and the safety measures at Airbnb.
Yeah.
So they implemented a few different improvements, or several different improvements, but one of the things that they implemented was a host guarantee up to $1 million, basically $1 million of insurance if anything happens to your place.
Yeah, right. Wow.
Which, made hosts feel much more comfortable
Right.
in the aftermath, because obviously when something like that happens, hosts start worrying. So they knew that they were covered. And then the last thing that I'll mention that had a huge impact on their business was COVID, the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, right.
So I don't know if like the general public was aware of this or not, but Airbnb, they thought, COVID was basically like an existential threat to their business, right? Like nobody was traveling.
Right. Yeah.
They lost all of their revenue.
Right. Oh.
And they didn't know how long this was going to go on for.
Right. Yeah.
So it really, the founders said, that, this felt like this could be it.
Right. Oh gosh.
So events were canceled.
Yeah.
People couldn't fly for a while. Like even if they could, people weren't comfortable with it.
Right.
They were canceling vacations.
Yep.
And the other thing is, in December 2019, they had started the paperwork to take Airbnb public. They were planning to go public in 2020. And when COVID hit in March 2020, those plans just fell apart because their revenue flatlined.
Yeah. The whole travel industry was affected by it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Oh.
So Airbnb went into crisis mode. They had to invent one because they hadn't had something like, nobody had had anything like this happen before. So they immediately took out a big loan because they didn't know how long they were going to be without business. So they got a huge loan. They provided a pretty significant payout to their hosts to help them sort of weather the storm during the pandemic, since they weren't getting revenue.
Right.
Which
was nice.
Really nice of them to do.
Yeah.
They fully refunded all of their guests who had booked time during the pandemic. So, without any questions, they just said, you can't travel or you don't feel comfortable, it's fine. Money back. They had to lay off employees for the first time in their history.
Yeah.
They laid off about 1,900 employees, which was like 25% of their staff.
Yeah.
But one thing that they did, which I remember reading about this at the time, they gave a very generous severance package. So they allowed employees to keep their company equipment, so they could keep their laptops, which, is pretty cool because in case you didn't have a computer, you're going to need that for job hunting and, whatever. They gave them full health benefits for 12 months.
Wow.
Paid.
That is really nice.
And a pretty generous severance package, too. I think the minimum that any employee got was 14 weeks plus additional time for years of service.
Yeah.
So, and they actually kind of started a trend, it seems like, in tech of doing that when at least the larger tech companies had to lay off employees during COVID. They tended to give out pretty large severance packages. Fortunately for them, the damage to their business only lasted about a quarter of the year. So the interesting thing was people started to travel again, only a few months later.
Right.
And instead of staying in hotels,
they felt
where there's going to be a lot of people and crowds, you got to get in an elevator with somebody, you got to stand in line to check in, like all this stuff. People wanted their own place somewhere.
They felt more comfortable like being in an Airbnb.
Yeah.
That's so true.
It actually led to another boom in Airbnb's
awesome.
business.
Oh, wow.
It was good for them. Yeah. So another thing was people started taking longer vacations.
Right.
And so they would stay longer, and hosts would have their places rented out for longer durations. They'd take more trips more often. They'd drive somewhere closer to home rather than flying.
Right. People could also, people were working from home so that they could, stay in Airbnbs longer and just work from there.
Yeah, exactly. So many people moved during the pandemic, and some of them did just what you said. They moved from Airbnb to Airbnb.
Yeah.
Because they realized, for a lot of people, it was the first time they could ever work from home, and they could work from anywhere.
Right.
So Airbnb really benefited from. They would never phrase it like this, but the aftermath of the early pandemic really helped Airbnb.
Right.
So, another thing with hotels, a lot of times people chose hotels because of the amenities, like if they needed a gym or they needed a spa or something like that. Most of those things were closed.
Yeah, right.
So, there really wasn't a reason for people to be going to prefer hotels at this time.
Right.
So, it didn't take long. Airbnb ended up going public in December of 2020.
Oh, God.
So, they still went public in 2020.
Yeah.
As of 2023, there are over 4 million hosts and 6 million property listings worldwide on Airbnb.
Yeah, I believe that.
In the U.S. alone, there's over 660,000 Airbnb listings, while there are a little over 5 million hotel rooms in the U.S.
Yeah, wow.
So, it hasn't surpassed the volume of hotels, but it's still growing fast.
Yeah, it's climbing.
And people stay at Airbnbs about 2.5 times longer than a typical hotel stay.
Interesting. Do you know why?
I think it's just, I think part of it is that for a lot of business travel, you have very short stays in hotels.
Okay.
And while some people do travel and stay at Airbnbs for business, they tend to be used more for vacations, which tend to be longer, things like that. It didn't, what I've researched didn't actually say, but that's, one hypothesis I have.
Okay.
So as of today, Airbnb is currently worth over $88 billion.
Oh my gosh. Just when I think about what they started with.
Yeah. And all those investors that passed early on in Airbnb. Every investor has a story of, the one that got away or the company they should have invested in.
Yeah.
But you have to feel extra scummy to have been rude, as rude as some of the investors were to them.
Smoothie man.
Yeah. to pass up on, something like Airbnb.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
So that's the story of Airbnb.
That is a steep journey. There were times where I would put myself in their situation and I would have probably just given up pretty quickly, because it's scary and because you don't know what the next step, when you can't tell what the future holds, that's a scary thought to me. And there's a reason why maybe I haven't jumped all in on something or whatever, but Yeah. I mean, just quitting your job and like not even having enough in the bank to pay for next month's rent.
And not that, I mean, that was before they even had an idea.
Right.
Like,
yeah. Yeah.
and then the conviction to take out all these credit cards
Yeah.
and rack up that much personal debt
I know.
when, I mean, they saw something that other people didn't see
For
clearly.
sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's not to say that this was a guarantee. Like they could have just as easily failed.
Right.
And
Oh, yeah. I know. And
they had to have a lot of things
yeah.
go right.
Right. And they did. Someone's definitely watching out for them.